The healing blood is arguably the central feature of the game Bloodborne. But what exactly is it? There are clues woven into the game to help us figure this out. None more important than those in the opening cutscene. Less than a minute into the game, we find ourselves on an operating table in a clinic, stretched out on our backs. We're administered a strange substance and suddenly everything gets hazy. In seconds, we're passed out. As lore enthusiasts and players, we can simply tell ourselves, oh, that's just the strange cosmic effect of the healing blood. But let's keep it simple. If you were on an operating table, what substance would cause you to lose consciousness? From Software is treating the healing blood as a proxy for anesthesia. In the next 20 minutes, I'll lay out a raft of evidence that the healing blood is meant to represent the potent anesthetics of the Victorian era, and that the game Bloodborne is likely a massive drug-induced nightmare. Stick with me and see if you agree. In the first video of this series, I discussed how the lives and works of Victorian authors William Ernest Henley and Robert Louis Stevenson serve as the foundation of the game. I noted in the opening video that in his 1875 poems titled Hospital Sketches, Henley repeatedly made mention of powerful anesthetics of the mid to late 1800s. And if we examine the healing blood through the lens of the medical metaphor that permeates Bloodborne, we find abundant evidence that this substance is based upon the real-world consumption and application of a Victorian-era anesthetic. It's ether. Diethyl ether rose to prominence in the Victorian era thanks to the discovery of its potent pain-killing and invigorating properties. Beginning in the 1840s, ether became a leading anesthetic for major medical procedures, but it also became a recreational drug in many parts of Europe in the latter half of the century. It remained popular among the lower classes in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland, well into the 20th century. Ether provides a strong, rapidly onsetting inebriation, and because of its powerful pain-suppressing qualities, it was considered a universal cure by Polish peasants. Ether can be consumed like alcohol, but the inebriating effects are far stronger, and ether imparts a unique sense of euphoria. These characteristics accurately describe the effects of Bloodborne's healing blood, which, like ether, is considered by the masses as a sort of panacea or cure-all. It's no surprise then that in Yharnam, the healing blood, according to the pungent blood cocktail, is more intoxicating than alcohol. The pungent blood cocktail, thanks to its name, also helps us identify one of the most important elements connecting the healing blood to ether. It's the smell. Ether is renowned for its sweet smell, so much so that it was originally called the sweet oil of vitriol, the term vitriol referring to the glassy look of liquid ether. Ether, when consumed in liquid form, continues to emanate a potent smell from the drinker even days after consumption, slowly dissipating through the breath and the skin and penetrating everything around, including clothing, fabrics, and even wood. In communities in which ether drinking was common, churches and other public spaces were said to smell of ether for days after large gatherings. The evidence, as we can see, begins to paint a picture. In ether, we have a highly intoxicating substance that provides a euphoric effect, is considered a universal cure, and has a sweet, potent smell. This sounds just like the healing blood. As you might have deduced, the smell is particularly relevant. Bloodborne's hunters, the heaviest users of the healing blood, are said to have a distinctive smell. We receive this piece of information from multiple sources. Gascoigne's daughter, through her window in central Yharnam, tells the player, "I don't know your voice, but I do know that smell. Are you a hunter?" Ariana notices the smell of the player character when we first encounter her in the cathedral ward. "Oh my," she says, "what a queer scent. But I'd take it over the stench of blood and beasts any day." The chapel dweller in Eden Chapel indicates that hunters have a unique smell, saying, "Oh, you must be a hunter. Very sorry, the incense must have masked your scent." Because hunters are the heaviest users of the sweet-smelling healing blood, it stands to reason that the hunter's unique scent results directly from blood use. One strong piece of evidence of the olfactory effect of the healing blood comes from Gascoigne himself. During his boss fight, Gascoigne says, "What's that smell? The sweet blood. Oh, it sings to me. It's enough to make a man sick." Aside from the fact that ether consumption can cause extreme nausea and vomiting, Gascoigne refers to the blood as sweet-smelling. This all reinforces the idea that ether is the real-life inspiration for the healing blood. The definitive proof that ether is the basis for the healing blood comes from Robert Louis Stevenson and his gothic horror tale, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The story serves as the basis for both the beastly transformation in Bloodborne and the mythos of the healing blood. In Stevenson's short story, Dr. Jekyll is a reputable doctor and chemist in London in the mid-1800s. As a medical scholar, he's dedicated himself to the furtherance of knowledge and the relief of sorrow and suffering. In short, he wants to create substances that will heal people. In his experiments with various chemical agents, Jekyll discovers that some agents possess powerful inebriating effects that he cannot resist. He eventually creates a potent serum that gives him great pleasure, but results in a grisly transformation into Mr. Hyde, a manifestation of Jekyll's basest instincts. Stevenson's story, not surprisingly, has long been considered a parable of the dangers of substance abuse. It's rumored that Stevenson wrote the story after a period of experimentation with cocaine himself. But there's a critical detail that helps us confirm that the story served as the inspiration for the healing blood, and that ether is indeed the real-life substance upon which the blood is based. The popular and extremely likely theory among literary historians is that Stevenson authored Jekyll and Hyde after learning of the tragic tale of Horace Wells. Wells was an American dentist in the 1840s who began using nitrous oxide, or laughing gas, on patients during what otherwise would be painful dental procedures. He was also one of the first medical professionals to experiment with ether. In 1845, Wells attempted to demonstrate the value of nitrous oxide as a surgical anesthetic in a presentation to the Massachusetts General Hospital. Unfortunately for Wells, the gas likely had been incorrectly administered to the patient, a man who was an overweight alcoholic upon whom a longer exposure would have been required. The patient groaned during the procedure, leading physicians in the audience to scoff and dismiss Wells as a quack. So dejected by the failed demonstration was Wells that within 3 years he had shuttered his dental practice, abandoned his wife and infant son, moved to New York, and began experimenting first with ether and then with chloroform, testing them on himself. Wells developed an addiction to the substances and experienced significant behavioral changes. After rushing into the street and throwing sulfuric acid on the clothing of 2 prostitutes, his second such violent outburst in a week, Wells was committed to New York's Tombs prison. After sobering up and coming to his senses while incarcerated, Wells was overcome with guilt. Somehow, he was able to secure a temporary release to retrieve personal items from his home, including his shaving kit. Wells used the opportunity to smuggle a razor and a bottle of chloroform into his cell upon his return. He gave himself a final dose of chloroform and used the razor to slice his femoral artery, bleeding to death in his cell. In Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, Dr. Jekyll becomes addicted to his serum, requiring larger and larger doses to produce desired effects. When transformed into Mr. Hyde, he exhibits violent behavior, including knocking over a young girl and later beating a man to death with a cane. In a period of clarity, Jekyll pens a lengthy confession note before permanently transforming into Hyde. In the end, Jekyll locks himself in his laboratory and kills himself with poison as 2 men attempt to break down the door. The comparisons here can't be missed. Jekyll becomes addicted to a chemical concoction, physically transforms, exhibits violent behavior, and commit suicide, just like Horace Wells became addicted to ether and chloroform, experienced major behavioral transformation, engaged in violent acts, and ultimately committed suicide. Ether, a chemical agent used by doctors, was the substance that hooked Horace Wells. The serum that created Mr. Hyde was an agent compounded by a chemist and doctor, Henry Jekyll. Within Bloodborne, as we've shown, the healing blood is exceptionally similar to ether. And just like ether did with Horace Wells, and an ether-like substance did with Dr. Jekyll, the ether-like healing blood in Bloodborne is behind the beastly transformation that has taken over Yharnam. From Software based the healing blood off of Jekyll and Hyde, which itself was based on Horace Wells. Although consumed commonly in liquid form in the 1800s, ether was used in medical and recreational capacities as a vapor, which was inhaled. In the 1840s and 50s, physicians would douse a handkerchief or napkin in ether or chloroform and hold it close to the nose of the patient until they passed out. But the practice was rather inartful and could kill the patient if they were overexposed. So doctors turned to more advanced methods of administering the anesthetic. One such method was invented by the former partner of Horace Wells, a man named William T.G. Morton, who crafted a device called an etherizer. The etherizer contained a sponge soaked in ether that would vaporize once the container was placed in warm water. If it hadn't occurred to you already, the etherizer bears a striking resemblance to an item in Bloodborne, the numbing mist. The comparisons are easy to make. The containers, of course, are virtually identical. And something that causes numbing would be an anesthetic. But within the numbing mist vial, we can see a glassy liquid, much like ether, evaporating into a mist or vapor, just as we would see with an etherizer. By the middle of the 19th century, ether had quickly become the world's leading general anesthetic after American and Scottish physicians in the 1840s discovered its application in surgical procedures. The first patient to receive ether as a surgical anesthetic was a man named Gilbert Abbott. In Boston in 1846, Abbott had part of a tumor removed from his neck. The affair was closely scrutinized because physicians worldwide had been longing for a sufficient anesthetic to perform pain-free surgeries. Abbott was tied to a chair for the surgery in order to remain upright so as to not choke on his own blood. In Bloodborne, the player character almost immediately encounters a man named Gilbert, who came to Yharnam to treat an unknown illness. Gilbert received the healing blood, presumably in Yosefka's clinic, which is littered with restraining chairs just like the one used for Gilbert Abbott's surgery. Observers of Abbott's surgery quickly realized that ether was a successful surgical anesthetic. When doctors asked Abbott how he felt after he regained consciousness following the procedure, Abbott replied, "Feels as if my neck's been scratched," as if to say, meh, it was just a scratch. In Bloodborne, our acquaintance Gilbert eventually succumbs to the healing blood and transforms into a beast, specifically a beast patient. When killed, he drops the clawmark rune, scratches and all. While the clawmark rune, of course, looks like scratch marks, if we look at it through the medical metaphor lens, we can see that it looks remarkably similar to a surgical incision that has been stitched up. The diagonal line can be viewed as the surgical incision. The vertical lines, hence, are the sutures or the surgical thread stitching the wound together. Our friend Gilbert is meant to represent Gilbert Abbott, the first person to undergo surgery under the influence of ether. As we've seen with the Hunter rune and now the Clawmark rune, the artwork of the Carol runes will tie into surgery and other medical and scientific concepts, which I'll discuss from time to time. If you're still skeptical that the healing blood is a proxy for Victorian-era anesthetics, this will probably change your mind. In the opening cutscene of the game, we're administered the healing blood and seem to drift off into a dreamlike state. We awaken in this haze, flat on our back on the operating table, unable to move. We pan the room from our first-person viewpoint. After the scourge beast retreats in flames, the glowing messengers emerge from beneath the table, begin to crawl all over the player character. It's hard to see how this scene wasn't influenced by the work of English artist Richard Tennant Cooper. Cooper is a little-known figure who was born in 1885 in Tonbridge in southeastern England. He trained as an artist in France and appears to have spent much of his early adult life in London and Paris, cities that were no strangers to mass disease and death. Cooper completed most of his known works following his service in the British Army during World War I. These life experiences influence Cooper's paintings, which fixate on disease, urban decay, war, and the macabre face of modern medicine. As we can see here, the opening cutscene of the game was undoubtedly drawn from Cooper's haunting work titled "An Unconscious Naked Man Lying on a Table, Being Attacked by Little Demons Armed with Surgical Instruments," or, for short, representing the effects of chloroform on the human body. The painting was inspired by Cooper's own experience undergoing an appendicitis operation, for which he was administered chloroform. As we discussed in the first video of this series, William Ernest Henley's works also were inspired by his experience of surgery under the effects of chloroform. From Software, in drawing from Cooper's painting to craft the opening cutscene, is telling us that the healing blood is meant to represent Victorian-era anesthetics like chloroform and ether. To sum up, in this video, we've established that the healing blood shares the inebriating, addictive, and panacea-like qualities of ether, as well as its unique sweet smell. It was the chemical compound that led physician Horace Wells down a path of transformation, addiction, and suicide, serving as the basis for Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which we can see is extremely similar to the beast-like change we observe in Bloodborne. Finally, we've seen that the art based on the effects of chloroform was used to craft the opening cutscene of the game. Taking all this evidence into consideration, we can confidently say that Bloodborne's healing blood is meant to represent the highly intoxicating, highly addictive anesthetics of the Victorian era, and the administration of the healing blood in the opening cutscene is meant to represent the start of an anesthetic hallucination or dream that began when we, the player character, were lying on the operating table in the clinic. In the next video, we can build upon this conclusion to see how the beastly scourge of Yharnam is in fact meant to represent the loss of one's humanity to addiction.